Chapter 1. The Catch That Changed Everything. There's a moment in Season 7 I keep coming back to. Not the lineup itself, not Abraham's death. Something that happened just after. Glenn Rhee, kneeling in the dirt with Negan's shadow falling across his face, looking up at a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, the bat coming down, and Glenn's hands moving up to meet it. What if Glenn had caught Lucille that night? What if his reflexes, the same ones that had kept him alive through every supply run, every close call with walkers, every moment when a split-second decision meant the difference between breathing and dying? What if they had kicked in at exactly the wrong moment to become exactly the right one? Tonight, let's follow that thread. Abraham's blood is still wet on the gravel when Negan turns toward Glenn. There's something almost casual in the way he hefts Lucille. Like he's done this so many times, the weight of the bat has become an extension of his own arm. The Saviors form their circle, their weapons trained on Rick's group, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Glenn sees the arc the bat will take. Down toward his skull, down toward Maggie, down toward everything that matters. His hands come up without conscious thought. The moment Lucille meets his palms, everything changes. The barbed wire bites deep, immediately drawing blood that runs hot between his fingers and drips to mix with Abraham's in the dirt below. Pain shoots through his hands like lightning, but Glenn holds on, has to hold on. Because letting go means dying, and dying means leaving Maggie alone in this world, and he's never been able to do that. Not when they were trapped in the prison. Not when the governor's people came for them. Not when Terminus turned out to be a trap. Not now. The silence that follows is the kind that swallows sound. Even the walkers beyond the tree line seem to pause their eternal shuffle. Negan's face cycles through surprise, then something that might be amusement, then something harder to read. His grip on Lucille's handle tightens as he tries to pull the bat back, but Glenn's fingers are locked around the barbed wire, like he's holding on to the last rope over a cliff. "Well, well," Negan says, and his voice carries that particular tone Glenn has learned to fear in other men, the one that means violence is coming, but wrapped in the pretense of conversation. "That's a first." Glenn's hands are on fire. The barbed wire has found every nerve ending in his palms, and he can feel warm blood running down his wrists, soaking into the sleeves of his jacket. But he doesn't let go. Can't let go, because in the periphery of his vision, he can see Maggie watching, her face pale with terror and something else, hope, maybe, or disbelief that he's still breathing. "Not today," Glenn says, and his voice comes out steadier than he feels. The words surprise him. He hadn't planned to speak, hadn't planned any of this. But there's something about holding Negan's weapon, about being the one in control of Lucille for the first time since this nightmare began, that makes him feel less like a victim and more like something else. Someone else. Rick's eyes are wide, his mouth slightly open, like he's witnessing something that doesn't fit into any category his mind has prepared for. Daryl is frozen in place, still restrained by two saviors, and Glenn can see the guilt written across his face. Guilt because Daryl knows this is happening, because of his outburst, because he couldn't keep his fists to himself when Negan killed Abraham. But there's something else in Daryl's expression now. Something that looks almost like pride. The saviors shift restlessly, weapons rising slightly, waiting for Negan's command. But Negan just stands there, studying Glenn like he's seeing him for the first time. Like Glenn has just revealed himself to be something more interesting than another victim in a long line of victims. "You know," Negan says conversationally, not making any move to reclaim his bat, "most people just piss themselves at this point. Start begging. Start promising me things they can't deliver. He tilts his head. But you caught Lucille. That takes either balls or stupidity, and I'm genuinely curious which one we're dealing with here. Glenn's hands are screaming now. The barbed wire has carved deep grooves in his palms, and he can feel individual droplets of blood hitting the ground with soft, wet sounds. But Maggie is watching, and Rick is watching, and everyone is watching, and Glenn realizes that this moment, this impossible moment where he holds Negan's weapon in his bleeding hands, this might be the only chance any of them get. I'm not stupid, Glenn says, meeting Negan's eyes. And I'm not letting you turn my death into your show. Something shifts in the air around them. The Saviors sense it too, the way the dynamic has suddenly become something none of them prepared for. This was supposed to be simple. This was supposed to be Negan demonstrating his power, making his point, ensuring compliance through fear. But Glenn has introduced a variable that doesn't fit the script. Negan's smile is sharp and cold, but there's genuine interest behind it now. Well, shit, he says. I did not see that coming. He releases his grip on Lucille entirely, leaving Glenn holding the full weight of the bat. So what now, Korean kid? What's your grand plan here? Glenn doesn't have a grand plan. All he has is the certainty that he will not die kneeling in the dirt while Maggie watches. All he has is the weight of Lucille in his hands, and the knowledge that for the first time since this nightmare began, Negan looks uncertain. All he has is the wild hope that maybe, just maybe, catching a baseball bat was the first step toward catching a future where he and Maggie survive this. Now, Glenn says, adjusting his grip despite the pain, we talk. The psychological chess match has begun. Chapter 2. Blood and Defiance. The first rule of survival that Glenn learned in Atlanta was never to let go of something that's keeping you alive. Whether it was a fire escape ladder 3 stories up, a fence post with walkers pressing against the other side, or the hand of someone you love when the world is ending around you, you hold on. You hold on until your muscles give out, until your bones break, until there's nothing left of you but the holding on itself. Standing in the dirt with Negan's bat in his bleeding hands, Glenn holds on. Negan's first attempt to reclaim Lucille is almost casual, a quick jerk backward, like he's pulling a toy away from a child. But Glenn's fingers have locked around the barbed wire with the desperate strength of someone who knows that letting go means dying, and Negan's surprise is visible the moment he realizes his weapon isn't coming free. The bat doesn't budge. If anything, Glenn's grip tightens, fresh blood welling up where the wire bites deeper into his palms. You got some brass balls, Korean kid, Negan says, and there's something in his voice that Glenn has never heard directed at him before. Respect. Grudging, maybe violent, but respect nonetheless. It's the tone you use when you're talking to an equal instead of a victim. But brass balls don't make you bulletproof. Glenn's hands are past pain now, settling into something that feels like holding fire. He can feel every individual barb, every twist of wire, every place where metal meets flesh and draws blood. His jacket sleeves are soaked red to the elbows, and when he shifts his weight, he can hear the soft drip of blood hitting the gravel like rain on leaves. But he doesn't let go. Can't let go. Because 3 feet away, Maggie is watching with tears streaming down her face, and Glenn has never been able to stand the sight of Maggie crying. I'm not dying for your show, Glenn says, and his voice carries a steadiness that surprises him. The words feel like they're coming from someone else, someone braver and more certain than the Glenn who used to deliver pizza and dream of better days. I'm not dying away from Maggie. That's when Maggie screams his name. It's not a cry for help or a plea for him to stop. It's the sound of someone watching the person they love balance on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step means losing everything. The sound cuts through the night air like a blade, and for a moment, everyone in the clearing, saviors and survivors alike, freezes. Even Negan glances toward her, his expression shifting into something that might be calculation. "Maggie," he says thoughtfully, like he's tasting the name. "That's your wife, isn't it? The pregnant one." His smile returns, sharper now, more focused. "Simon." Simon steps forward from the circle of saviors, his hand moving to his weapon. He's tall and lean with the kind of mustache that suggests he takes himself very seriously, and when he moves toward Maggie, there's purpose in his stride. Glenn's blood turns to ice water in his veins. "Don't," Glenn says, and the word comes out harder than he intended. His grip on Lucille shifts, and he realizes that somewhere in the last few minutes, he stopped thinking of it as Negan's weapon and started thinking of it as his own. "Don't touch her." But Simon is already moving, already reaching for Maggie with hands that Glenn knows will hurt her just because they can. The moment Simon's fingers close around Maggie's arm, something breaks open in Glenn's chest. Not fear. He's been afraid since the moment they fell into Negan's trap. Not pain. His hands are already ruined. Something deeper. Something that sounds like the snap of a rope under too much weight. "Let her go," Glenn says, and his voice carries across the clearing like a gunshot. "Or I break your precious bat in half." The threat hangs in the air between them, and Glenn realizes he means it. His hands might be shredded, but they're still strong enough to twist Lucille until the wood splinters. Strong enough to destroy the thing Negan clearly values more than any human life. Strong enough to take away the symbol of everything Negan represents. "Glenn, don't," Rick whispers from somewhere behind him, and Glenn can hear the desperation in Rick's voice. Rick, who has carried the weight of keeping everyone alive for so long that he's forgotten there might be other ways to lead than through careful calculation and strategic surrender. Rick, who is watching one of his people take a stand when Rick himself couldn't find the courage to do it. But Glenn's focus remains locked on Negan, on the way the man's expression is cycling through surprise and anger and something that might be genuine admiration. Negan is looking at Glenn like he's seeing him for the first time. Like the person kneeling in the dirt with blood dripping from his hands is entirely different from the quiet supply runner who used to fade into the background of group meetings. From the edge of his vision, Glenn can see Daryl, still restrained by saviors but straining against their grip. There are tears in Daryl's eyes, tears of guilt and rage and helplessness. Daryl knows this is happening because of his outburst, because he couldn't control his grief when Abraham fell. But there's something else in Daryl's expression now, something that looks like hope. Like maybe Glenn catching that bat was the first step toward something none of them saw coming. "You think you're in control here?" Negan laughs, but the sound doesn't carry its usual confidence. "Boy, you're bleeding all over my Lucille. You can't hold on forever." He's right, and Glenn knows it. His hands are shredded, his strength is finite, and Simon still has Maggie's arm in a grip that's making her wince. But Glenn has spent years learning that forever isn't the goal. Survival is. And survival sometimes means finding a way to last just long enough for the situation to change. Just long enough for an opportunity. Just long enough for the person you love to stay breathing for one more day. "I don't have to hold on forever," Glenn says, adjusting his grip despite the fire in his palms. "I just have to hold on longer than you want to wait." The standoff stretches between them like a wire under tension, and Glenn realizes that this moment, this impossible balance between violence and negotiation, between death and defiance. This is where everything changes. Not just for him, not just for Maggie, but for everyone who has ever knelt in the dirt, while someone with power decided whether they got to keep breathing. Negan's eyes narrow, studying Glenn with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that's more complex than it first appeared. The clearing has gone silent, except for the sound of blood dripping, and Maggie's quiet crying, and the distant shuffle of walkers who can smell violence in the air, but can't quite reach it. "Well, shit," Negan says finally. "I didn't see this coming." Glenn's hands are on fire. His vision is starting to blur at the edges from pain and adrenaline, and he can feel his strength bleeding away, drop by drop into the Georgia dirt. But Maggie is still breathing, Rick is still watching, and Negan is still talking instead of swinging. Sometimes, Glenn thinks, that's enough to call a victory. For now. Chapter 3. The breaking point. There's a particular quality to the moment when someone with absolute power realizes their authority is being questioned. Not challenged in the abstract, not defied through whispered rebellion or hidden resistance, but questioned openly in front of witnesses by someone who is supposed to be powerless. The air itself seems to thicken, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, and everyone present feels the electric potential of violence about to break loose, standing in the circle of saviors with Glenn's blood dripping steadily onto the ground. Negan reaches that moment. His patience, which has carried him through the theatrical execution of Abraham and the careful choreography of terror that followed, finally begins to fray. Glenn can see it in the way Negan's jaw tightens, in the slight tension that creeps into his shoulders, in the way his free hand curls into a fist at his side. The man who has built his entire identity around control is watching that control slip away, drop by bloody drop, and he doesn't like what he sees. "Dwight," Negan says without taking his eyes off Glenn, and his voice carries a cold finality that makes everyone in the clearing tense. "Put a bolt in your crossbow and aim it at the pregnant girl's head." The words hit Glenn like a physical blow. He feels his resolve waver for the first time since this impossible standoff began, his hands trembling, not just with pain now, but with something closer to terror. Dwight moves with practiced efficiency, loading his crossbow with the kind of smooth motion that speaks to years of killing. The metallic click of the bolt sliding into place echoes across the clearing like a death knell. "Drop my bat," Negan says, his voice dropping to conversational tones that somehow carry more menace than any scream, "or your girlfriend gets an arrow through her pretty skull." Glenn's grip on Lucille loosens involuntarily, and fresh blood wells up where the barbed wire shifts against his ravaged palms. Maggie is 6 feet away, close enough that he can see the tears tracking down her cheeks, close enough that he can see her hands instinctively move to protect the life growing inside her, close enough that Dwight can't possibly miss. For a moment that stretches like an eternity, Glenn's world narrows to a single point of decision. His hands, slick with blood and screaming with pain. Maggie's face, pale with fear, but still trusting him to find a way out of this. The crossbow bolt pointed at everything he has left to lose. Abraham's lifeless body sprawled in the dirt, a grim reminder of what Negan's patience looks like when it finally runs out. This is where most people break. Glenn knows it. Negan knows it. Everyone watching knows it. This is the moment where survival instinct overwhelms everything else, where love becomes a weapon that can be used against you, where holding on stops being brave and starts being selfish. Most people would let go. Most people would take the chance that Negan might show mercy, that surrendering might buy time, that someone else might find a solution. Glenn is not most people. "Don't give up!" The voice cuts through the tension like a blade, young and fierce and absolutely certain. Carl, 16 years old and wearing his father's gun like it belongs to him, his remaining eye blazing with the kind of righteous fury that only comes from watching too many good people die. "Don't let him win!" The words hit Glenn like a shot of adrenaline, straight to the heart. Carl, who has grown up in this world of monsters and learned to find courage in impossible places. Carl, who is watching an adult make the kind of stand that Carl himself has made a dozen times over, refusing to bow to bullies with bigger weapons and louder voices. Carl, who understands that sometimes the only choice is to keep fighting, even when fighting seems hopeless. Michonne shifts almost imperceptibly beside Rick, her hand moving toward her katana with subtle precision. Her voice, when she speaks, is pitched low enough that only Rick can hear. But Glenn catches the words anyway. "We need to act," she says, and there's steel in her voice. "We can't just watch this happen." But Rick remains frozen, his face a mask of calculation and fear. Rick, who has kept them alive through impossible odds by knowing when to fight and when to surrender, trapped now by the weight of his own caution. Rick, who is watching one of his people take the lead for the first time in years and doesn't know whether to feel proud or terrified. Glenn's hands are past pain now, settling into something that feels like holding lightning. But his mind is clearer than it's been since this nightmare started. He can see the whole tableau spread out before him, the positions of the saviors, the weapons they carry, the slight gaps in their formation. He can see Negan's left side, slightly unguarded, because the man is so focused on the psychological battle over Lucille that he's forgotten to watch his flanks. He can see Sasha and Rosita exchanging a meaningful glance, their hands moving almost imperceptibly toward concealed weapons. Most importantly, he can see something in Negan's eyes that he doesn't think Negan realizes is showing. Something that looks almost like uncertainty. "You're scared," Glenn says aloud, and the realization hits him like a revelation. You're scared because you've never been challenged like this before. The effect is immediate and electric. Negan's carefully constructed mask of control cracks just slightly, letting something raw and dangerous show through. His grip on Lucille's handle tightens until his knuckles turn white, and for the first time since this confrontation began, Glenn sees the man behind the mythology. "I am not scared of some delivery boy," Negan snarls, and the words come out louder than he intended, angrier than his usual performance. "You think because you got lucky once, because you managed to grab my bat, that makes you something special? You're nothing. You're a scared little man bleeding all over my weapon." But Glenn has spent years reading people. It was the only way to survive on supply runs, the only way to know which strangers might trade fairly and which ones would cut your throat for a can of beans. He knows desperation when he sees it, knows the particular way someone's voice changes when they're trying to convince themselves as much as their audience. Negan is scared. Not of Glenn specifically, but of what Glenn represents, of the idea that his carefully constructed world of absolute authority might not be as solid as he thought, of the possibility that someone might stand up to him and refuse to fall down, of the chance that his reputation for invincibility might develop its first crack. And Glenn, holding Lucille in his bleeding hands, with Dwight's crossbow pointed at everything he loves, realizes that fear can be a weapon too. "Then prove it," Glenn says, his voice steady despite the fire in his palms. "Prove you're not scared. Let Maggie go, call off your shooter, and face me without hiding behind threats." The The silence that follows is different from the shocked quiet that greeted Glenn's initial defiance. This is the silence of a room full of people holding their breath, waiting to see whether a bluff will be called or folded. Waiting to see whether Glenn's desperate gamble will pay off or get everyone he loves killed. Sasha catches Rosita's eye and nods almost imperceptibly. They understand what Glenn is doing, turning Negan's own psychology against him, using the man's need to appear strong to create an opening. It's the kind of tactical thinking they've come to expect from their quiet supply runner, the kind of unexpected strategy that has kept him alive when louder, more aggressive people have fallen. The tension in the clearing has reached its breaking point, balanced on the edge of a knife between negotiation and slaughter. Everyone present, saviors and survivors alike, seems to sense that the next few seconds will determine not just who lives and who dies, but something larger about how power works in this new world they're all trying to survive. Glenn's hands are destruction itself. His vision is starting to blur from blood loss, and he can feel his strength ebbing with every heartbeat. But he can also feel something else, the weight of everyone's attention, the electric possibility that maybe, just maybe, refusing to kneel might be enough to change everything. Negan's eyes narrow as he studies Glenn with the intensity of a predator, trying to decide whether its prey might actually be dangerous. The moment stretches between them like a wire under tension, ready to snap in either direction. "Well," Negan says finally, his voice carrying a note Glenn can't quite identify. This just got interesting. Chapter 4. Turning the tables. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is the thing no one expects you to do. Not because it's clever or strategic or carefully planned, but because it's so completely outside the realm of possibility that it creates a moment of total confusion, a gap between what should happen and what is happening that opens up space for everything to change. Glenn has spent his entire life in Atlanta, and beyond being the person no one expects to be dangerous. The quiet one. The one who finds supplies and fixes radios and keeps his head down when the louder voices start making of plans. The one who survived by being invisible, by slipping through spaces that bigger, stronger, more obvious people couldn't fit through. He has never been the person who grabs the weapon. Never been the person who makes the bold move. Until now. Glenn releases his left hand from Lucille so suddenly that fresh blood sprays across the dirt, and before Negan can process what's happening, Glenn's blood-slick fingers close around Negan's wrist with the desperate strength of someone who has nothing left to lose. Negan's eyes widen in surprise, the first genuine surprise Glenn has seen from him all night, as Glenn uses the man's own momentum against him. It's a move Glenn learned from Michonne during their long hours of practice in Alexandria, when she tried to teach him that sometimes the best defense is using an attacker's force to redirect their own weapon. Glenn had never been good at it in practice, his movements too hesitant, his timing always slightly off. But holding Lucille in the Georgia dirt with his life hanging in the balance, Glenn's timing is perfect. He spins the bat around in a smooth arc until its barbed wire tip comes to rest against Negan's throat just below the man's carefully groomed beard. The motion is so fluid, so unexpectedly graceful, that for a moment everyone in the clearing simply stares. Even the walkers beyond the tree line seem to pause their eternal shuffle, as if the universe itself is holding its breath. "Now we're going to talk like civilized people," Glenn says, and his voice carries a steadiness that surprises everyone present, including himself. Despite the blood streaming from his hands, despite the crossbow still trained on Maggie, despite the impossible nature of what he's just done, his words come out level and controlled. This is Glenn, as no one has ever seen him, Not the quiet supply runner, not the gentle husband, but someone capable of turning desperation into strategy. The response is immediate and electric. Saviors across the clearing raise their weapons, automatic rifles and handguns swinging toward Glenn with practiced precision. Shouts of alarm and rage fill the air, and for a moment it seems like the standoff will explode into gunfire that will leave everyone dead in the dirt. But Negan holds up his free hand, and the gesture cuts through the chaos like a blade. "Stand down!" he barks, and there's something in his voice that Glenn has never heard before. Not just authority, but actual respect. Nobody shoots unless I give the order. The weapons lower reluctantly, but Glenn can feel the tension radiating from the saviors like heat from a fire. They're used to their leader being untouchable, used to situations that unfold according to Negan's careful choreography. The sight of their boss with a weapon at his throat, held by someone they had dismissed as harmless, has shaken something fundamental in their worldview. From behind him, Glenn hears Rick's voice, strained and desperate. "Glenn, what are you doing?" The question hangs in the air, and Glenn realizes it's not really about tactics or strategy. It's about leadership. Rick has been the one who makes the hard choices, who carries the weight of keeping everyone alive, who decides when to fight and when to surrender. And now Glenn is making choices that Rick never considered, taking risks that Rick never calculated, leading in a way that Rick never imagined possible. "What you should have done," Glenn says, without taking his eyes off Negan. "Protecting our family." The words hit Rick like a physical blow, and Glenn can feel the shift in the group behind him. Not rebellion exactly, but a recognition that maybe there are other ways to lead than through careful calculation and strategic retreat. Maybe sometimes you have to take impossible risks for the people you love. Maybe sometimes you have to be willing to die standing up instead of living on your knees. Negan's laugh comes out as more of a chuckle, deep and genuinely amused despite the weapon at his throat. "You surprise me, kid," he says, and there's something almost like pride in his voice. "Most people just piss themselves at this point, start begging for mercy, promising me things they can't deliver. But you turned my own weapon against me. That takes stones." Glenn's hands are past the point of pain now, settled into something that feels like holding molten metal, but his mind is clearer than it's been since this nightmare began. He can see the whole situation spread out before him like a chessboard, can see the moves and countermoves available to both sides. Most importantly, he can see what Negan values most, not just control, but the respect that comes with being outmaneuvered by someone worthy. "Let everyone go," Glenn says, adjusting his grip on Lucille despite the fire in his palms. "Take me instead. One life for many." The offer hits the clearing like a thunderclap. Maggie's scream cuts through the night air. "No!" Raw and desperate and full of the kind of anguish that comes from watching someone you love volunteer for certain death. Glenn can hear her struggling against Simon's grip, can hear the sound of her tears hitting the ground like rain. But Glenn keeps his focus locked on Negan, on the way the man's expression is cycling through calculation and genuine intrigue. This is what Negan didn't expect. Not just defiance, but strategy. Not just someone willing to fight, but someone willing to think 3 moves ahead and offer something that might actually be valuable. "Interesting proposition," Negan says thoughtfully, and Glenn can see the gears turning behind his eyes. "You think you're worth more than the rest of them? You think trading one Korean delivery boy for a whole group of survivors is a fair deal?" From somewhere behind him, Glenn hears Eugene's voice, pitched so low it's almost a whisper. The optimal strategy would be to create multiple contingencies, establish escape routes, consider the psychological profile of the primary aggressor. The words trail off, and Glenn realizes Eugene is talking to Abraham's lifeless body, old habits kicking in under stress. Eugene trying to solve an impossible situation through analysis, even when the person he's talking to can no longer hear the solution. The sight would be heartbreaking if it weren't so perfectly, tragically Eugene. Finding comfort in tactical thinking, even in the face of total breakdown. Glenn files the information away, another piece of the puzzle he's trying to solve. Eugene's mind, even shattered by grief, might be an asset they can't afford to waste. But it's Daryl who provides the real surprise. Despite the saviors holding him, despite the weapons trained on him, despite everything that could go wrong, Daryl struggles to his feet. His voice, when he speaks, carries the weight of guilt and determination in equal measure. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my mistake. The words hit Glenn like a revelation. Daryl, who started this chain of events by striking out at Negan after Abraham's death. Daryl, who has been carrying the weight of responsibility for everything that followed. Daryl, who understands better than anyone what it means to make a desperate choice for the people you love. This ain't on you, Daryl continues, his voice rough with emotion. We all knew the risks when we came after them. Don't make this about fixing what I broke. Glenn feels something shift in his chest, not just his own resolve, but the recognition that he's not alone in this, that even in the face of impossible odds, the people he's fighting for are willing to fight alongside him. That maybe, just maybe, refusing to surrender doesn't have to mean dying alone. Negan watches this exchange with the intensity of someone studying a particularly fascinating chess match. Well, shit, he says finally, his voice carrying genuine admiration. Your people really do love you, don't they? That kind of loyalty, that's not something you can fake. That's not something you can beat into people. Glenn keeps the bat steady at Negan's throat, but he can feel the weight of everyone's attention, like a physical force. The saviors watching their invincible leader, held at bay by a bleeding supply runner. His own people watching him take the kind of stand that none of them saw coming. The night itself, holding its breath to see what happens when someone refuses to play by the rules that everyone else takes for granted. So what's it going to be? Glenn asks, his voice steady despite the fire in his hands. Do we keep dancing around each other? Or do we find a way for everyone to walk away from this? The question hangs between them like a bridge over an abyss, and Glenn realizes that this moment, this impossible balance between violence and negotiation, between death and hope, this is where everything pivots, not just for him and Maggie, not just for their group, but for the entire world they're all trying to survive in. Negan's eyes narrow as he studies Glenn with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that keeps changing shape. The clearing has gone silent, except for the sound of blood dripping, and Maggie's quiet crying, and the distant promise of dawn somewhere beyond the darkness. You know what? Negan says finally, his voice carrying a note that Glenn can't quite identify. I think we can work something out. Chapter 5. The counter-offer. There's a particular kind of silence that follows when someone offers you exactly what you never knew you wanted. Not the thing you thought you needed. Not the obvious solution to your immediate problem, but something deeper. A path you hadn't considered. A future you hadn't imagined. A version of yourself that might exist if you were willing to become someone entirely different. Standing in the Georgia dirt with Lucille's barbed wire pressed against Negan's throat, Glenn experiences that silence. I've got a better idea, Negan says, and his grin returns with the slow, predatory satisfaction of someone who has just seen all the pieces of a complex puzzle fall into place. You work for me. Be my number 2. Help me run this world properly." The words hit Glenn like a physical blow, so completely outside the realm of possibility that for a moment his mind simply refuses to process them. His grip on Lucille wavers slightly, fresh blood welling up where the barbed wire shifts against his ravaged palms. Behind him, he can hear Maggie's sharp intake of breath, can feel the shock radiating from his group like heat from an explosion. Work for Negan, the man who just murdered Abraham in cold blood, the man who was about to murder Glenn himself until Glenn turned the tables, the man whose entire existence seems built on the principle that might makes right, and the strong should dominate the weak. "Think about it," Negan continues, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a particularly elegant solution to a complex problem. No more scavenging through abandoned stores, hoping to find enough food to last another week. No more lying awake at night, wondering if walkers are going to breach your walls. No more fear. Just order and structure and the kind of safety that comes from being on the winning side. Glenn's hands are screaming with pain, but his mind is racing faster than it has since this nightmare began. He can see the offer for what it is, not just an attempt to recruit him, but a fundamental reframing of everything that's happening here. Negan isn't trying to break Glenn anymore. He's trying to buy him. "Glenn, don't listen to him!" Rick's voice cuts through the night air. But there's something hollow in it. Something that sounds less like authority and more like desperation. Rick, who has been the unquestioned leader of their group for so long, watching someone else negotiate for their lives. Rick, whose own strategic thinking never extended beyond survival to the kind of long-term planning that Negan is offering. But Glenn's focus remains locked on Negan, on the way the man's expression has shifted from amusement to something that might actually be genuine interest. "What about my friends?" Glenn asks, his voice steady despite the chaos in his thoughts. "My pregnant wife." "They get to live," Negan says immediately, like he's been anticipating the question. "Hell, they get premium treatment as your family. The best food, the safest housing, medical care for the baby when it comes. No more wondering if there's going to be enough formula. No more worrying about whether your kid will grow up in a world where every day is a fight for survival." The offer hits Glenn in a place he didn't know was vulnerable, because the truth is, he has wondered about those things, has lain awake next to Maggie in their small house in Alexandria, her hand resting on the growing curve of her belly, and worried about what kind of world they're bringing a child into. Has calculated and recalculated their supplies, their defenses, their chances of making it through another winter. Has felt the weight of responsibility for not just Maggie's life, but the life she's carrying, and wondered if love and determination are enough to keep them safe. "You see it, don't you?" Negan says, and his voice carries the satisfaction of someone who recognizes the exact moment when an argument hits home. "You're not just some supply runner, kid. You're a strategist. You think 3 moves ahead. You see patterns other people miss. That move you just pulled with my bat? That wasn't luck. That was tactical thinking under pressure. That's exactly the kind of mind I need, helping me build something that lasts." From somewhere behind Glenn, Maggie's voice rises above the tension. "Glenn, remember who he is. Remember Abraham." The words cut through the strange spell of Negan's offer like a blade, and Glenn's eyes drift involuntarily to Abraham's lifeless body sprawled in the dirt. Abraham, who was alive and talking and making terrible jokes just minutes ago. Abraham, whose blood is still warm on the gravel. Abraham, who died because Negan decided he needed to make a point about power and control. "You're a killer," Glenn says, meeting Negan's eyes again. So are you, when you need to be, Negan replies without hesitation. I've seen the reports from your supply runs, the way you handled that group of raiders who tried to ambush you outside Fairfax, the efficiency you showed clearing out that warehouse full of walkers, the strategic thinking you used to get your people out of that mess at the shopping center when everything went sideways. Glenn's blood turns to ice water. The specificity of Negan's knowledge is terrifying, not just that he knows about Glenn's activities, but that he's been watching, analyzing, building profiles of potential assets. The shopping center incident was months ago, and Glenn had never told anyone outside their immediate group about the details of how he'd managed to save everyone when they were trapped by a horde that came out of nowhere. You think survival is just about being nice to people and hoping they'll be nice back, Negan continues, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. But you know better. You've made the hard choices. You've killed when you had to kill. You've sacrificed the few to save the many. The only difference between us is that I'm honest about what this world requires. The moral complexity of the offer hits Glenn like a revelation he doesn't want to have. Because Negan isn't entirely wrong. Glenn has killed people. Raiders who would have murdered his friends. Desperate survivors who tried to take their supplies by force. Broken individuals who had become as dangerous as any walker. He's made calculations about who deserves to live and who doesn't. He's chosen the safety of his group over the welfare of strangers more times than he likes to remember. The difference, Glenn tells himself, is that he's never enjoyed it. Never built a philosophy around it. Never created a system where violence becomes the organizing principle of society. But even as he thinks it, he can hear the whisper of doubt in his own mind. Is it really so different? Is the line between necessary violence and systematic brutality as clear as he wants it to be? Don't become him, Glenn. Daryl's voice cuts through the internal debate, quiet but carrying absolute conviction. Stay who you are. The words anchor Glenn in a way that logic and argument couldn't, because Daryl knows what it means to be tempted by the dark path, knows what it costs to choose violence over humanity, knows how easy it is to lose yourself in the name of protecting the people you love. Daryl, who has spent years fighting his way back from the edge of becoming something monstrous, reminding Glenn that there's still a choice to be made. Glenn's grip on Lucille shifts, the barbed wire biting deeper into his palms, and he realizes that this moment, this impossible offer of power and safety and freedom from fear, this is the real test. Not whether he can hold a weapon to Negan's throat, but whether he can resist the temptation to become the kind of person who would use that weapon without hesitation. It's a generous offer, Glenn says, finally, his voice carrying a steadiness that surprises him. But there's one problem with your plan. Yeah? Negan's eyebrows raise with genuine interest. What's that? Glenn meets the man's eyes and sees something there that he's never noticed before. Not just intelligence and ruthlessness, but a kind of loneliness. The isolation that comes from being the person who makes the hard choices, who carries the weight of other people's survival, who has convinced himself that being feared is the same thing as being respected. I've already got a family, Glenn says, and they didn't become my family because I threatened to kill them if they didn't fall in line. The silence that follows carries a different quality than any that has come before. Not the shocked quiet of an unexpected move, not the tense waiting of violence about to erupt, but the thoughtful pause of someone considering an idea they've never encountered before. Negan's expression cycles through calculation and something that might be genuine surprise. Well, shit, he says finally. That's not the answer I was expecting. Glenn keeps Lucille steady at Negan's throat, but he can feel the weight of everyone's attention like a physical force. His own people watching him reject an offer of safety and power. The saviors watching their leader's recruitment attempt fail in real time. The night itself holding its breath to see what happens when someone chooses love over security, loyalty over survival. "So what now?" Negan asks, and there's something almost like respect in his voice. "You turned down my generous offer. You're still bleeding all over my weapon, and we're still standing here in the middle of nowhere with enough firepower pointed at each other to start our own little war." Glenn's hands are past the point of holding on much longer. His vision is starting to blur from blood loss, and he can feel his strength ebbing with every heartbeat. But he can also feel something else, the certainty that whatever happens next, he's made the right choice. Not the smart choice, not the safe choice, but the right one. "Now," Glenn says, adjusting his grip one final time, "we find out what you're really made of." Chapter 6. The decision. Sometimes the most important decisions are made, not in moments of careful deliberation, but in the space between heartbeats, when instinct and principle collide, and there's no time for second-guessing, when the choice comes down to who you are versus who you might survive by becoming, and the answer has to come from some place deeper than strategy or fear or even love. Standing in the Georgia dirt with Negan's offer hanging in the air like smoke, Glenn reaches that moment. He can feel the weight of everyone's attention pressing against him, like a physical force. His own people watching to see if he'll choose safety over loyalty. The saviors waiting to see if their leader's recruitment pitch will succeed. Negan himself, studying Glenn's face with the intensity of someone who has made a career out of reading people's breaking points and knowing exactly when to apply pressure. Glenn's hands are past the point of holding on much longer. The barbed wire has carved deep grooves in his palms, and he can feel his strength bleeding away drop by drop into the earth beneath his feet. But his mind is clearer than it's been since this nightmare began, focused with the kind of crystalline intensity that comes when you realize you're about to make a choice that will define everything that follows. "If I say yes," Glenn says slowly, and his voice carries a thoughtful quality that makes everyone lean closer. "You'll let everyone go back to Alexandria safely." "Cross my heart and hope to die," Negan replies, raising his free hand in a gesture of mock sincerity. But there's genuine satisfaction in his expression, the look of someone who recognizes the exact moment when a negotiation tips in their favor. "Your people go home, untouched and unharmed. You come with me, we build something better together, and everybody wins." Glenn nods slowly, like he's working through the logic of the offer, calculating the costs and benefits with the methodical precision he's always brought to supply runs and strategic planning. Around the clearing, he can feel the tension shifting, the electric possibility of violence being replaced by something that might actually be hope. "I need to think about this," Glenn says, and slowly, so slowly that it seems like surrender rather than strategy, he begins to release his grip on Lucille. The effect is immediate and exactly what Glenn was counting on. Negan's shoulders relax slightly, his stance shifting from defensive alertness to something closer to casual confidence. The saviors around the clearing lower their weapons just a fraction, their attention shifting from immediate threat assessment to watching their leader close what might be the most important recruitment in their organization's history. Even his own people seem to deflate slightly, the desperate energy of resistance giving way to something that looks like resignation. Rick's face cycles through relief and disappointment. Maggie's expression carries a heartbreak so profound that Glenn has to force himself not to look directly at her. but Darryl knows him better than anyone, and Darryl's eyes never leave Glenn's face. Waiting, watching, ready. The moment Negan relaxes his guard, the split second when victory makes him careless, Glenn moves. He drives his elbow into Negan's solar plexus with every ounce of strength he has left, putting behind it all the desperate love he feels for Maggie, all the fury he's carrying for Abraham's death, all the determination that has kept him alive through every impossible situation he's ever faced. The blow lands with a wet, satisfying sound that cuts through the night air like a gunshot. "I choose them," Glenn declares as Negan doubles over, gasping for air. And then the world explodes into chaos. The Savior's response is immediate and overwhelming. Automatic weapons open up across the clearing, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireworks. The sound is deafening, not just the crack of gunfire, but the whine of bullets splitting air, the wet thunk of rounds hitting trees, the sharp cries of alarm and pain that rise above the mechanical roar of violence unleashed. Glenn's people move with the fluid precision of survivors who have faced death together more times than any of them can count. They dive for cover behind fallen logs that line the edge of the clearing, using the natural terrain that Glenn noticed during his careful assessment of their surroundings. The defensive positions they find aren't perfect, but they're enough to keep the initial burst of gunfire from cutting everyone down in the first few seconds. Michonne's katana appears in her hands like magic, the blade catching moonlight as she flows between two saviors who are too close to their position. Her movement is liquid grace and lethal precision, years of practice distilled into motion, so efficient it looks almost effortless. The first savior falls before he fully understands what's happening. The second manages to turn toward her before the katana opens his throat in a line as clean as calligraphy. Carl moves with the kind of tactical awareness that should be terrifying in someone so young but has become as natural as breathing. A fallen savior's handgun lies just within reach of his position, and Carl snatches it up with movements that speak to countless hours of weapons training. His covering fire isn't random or panicked. Each shot is deliberate, calculated to create space for his family to reposition and regroup. "Now!" Rick's voice cuts through the gunfire, and suddenly he's moving like the leader he's always been, his earlier paralysis burned away by the immediate necessity of keeping everyone alive. His instructions come in short, sharp bursts that cut through the chaos. "Rosita, left flank. Aaron, watch R6. Sasha, high ground." But it's Glenn who provides the anchor point around which everything else revolves. Instead of diving for cover like everyone else, he tackles Negan to the ground as bullets whistle overhead. They hit the dirt hard, Glenn's weight driving the air from Negan's lungs all over again. Glenn's hands are slick with blood and screaming with pain, but his grip on Negan is iron strong, fueled by the desperate knowledge that letting go means losing the only advantage they have. "You made a mistake, kid," Negan gasps between attempts to throw Glenn off. "You had a chance to do this the easy way." "The easy way was never really an option," Glenn replies, shifting his weight to pin Negan more securely. Around them, the gunfight continues with the brutal intensity of people fighting for their lives, but Glenn's focus remains locked on the man beneath him. "Not for people like us." From the corner of his vision, Glenn sees something that makes his heart leap and stop simultaneously. Maggie, despite the bullets flying overhead, despite her pregnancy, despite every reason she has to stay safe behind cover, is crawling across the open ground toward him. Her face is set with the kind of determination Glenn has seen before, when she stood up to her father about their relationship, when she chose to stay and fight instead of running when the prison fell, when she decided that love was worth risking everything for. "Maggie, stay down!" Glenn shouts, but she keeps moving, using the chaos of the firefight as cover for her approach. There's something in her eyes that Glenn recognizes. Not recklessness, but the same desperate courage that drove Glenn to catch Negan's bat in the first place. The refusal to let the person you love face the darkness alone. Daryl breaks free from his captors in the confusion, his restraints forgotten in the Savior's panic, to respond to the sudden eruption of violence. He moves like a force of nature, unleashed, tackling the nearest Savior, with the kind of fury that has been building inside him since Abraham fell. The guilt and rage and helplessness that have been eating at him since his outburst started this chain of events finally find an outlet, and Daryl becomes something that even hardened saviors step back from. "This is what happens when you underestimate people," Glenn says to Negan, raising his voice to be heard over the gunfire. "You thought we were just victims waiting to be processed, but we're family, and family doesn't abandon family." Negan's response is cut off by the sharp crack of a rifle shot that sends splinters flying from the log just inches from Glenn's head. The reminder that they're in the middle of a firefight brings Glenn's tactical awareness flooding back, and he realizes that holding Negan might be strategically valuable, but it also makes him a stationary target in an increasingly deadly crossfire. The chaos around them has reached fever pitch. Muzzle flashes light up the darkness like strobe lights. The air fills with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic taste of violence, and the sound of combat creates a wall of noise that drowns out everything except the most essential communications. This is war in its rawest form, not the careful strategic planning Glenn is good at, but the brutal improvisation that separates survivors from victims. But through it all, Glenn can see his people moving with purpose and coordination, Rick directing their defense with the kind of tactical brilliance that has kept them alive through every impossible situation. Michonne flowing between enemies like death given form. Carl providing covering fire with precision that shouldn't be possible for someone his age. Daryl fighting like a man possessed, working through his guilt one fallen savior at a time. And Maggie still crawling toward him across ground that's becoming increasingly dangerous, her face set with love and determination in equal measure. "You want to know the difference between us?" Glenn asks Negan, his voice carrying over the sound of gunfire through pure force of will. "I don't fight because I enjoy it. I fight because some things are worth fighting for." The gunfight continues to rage around them, but Glenn realizes that something fundamental has changed. Not just in the immediate tactical situation, but in something deeper. His people are no longer victims. They're no longer kneeling in the dirt, waiting for someone else to decide their fate. They're fighting back. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Glenn thinks they might actually win. Chapter 7. Escape and Consequences. There's a particular moment in every firefight when the chaos reaches its peak and then breaks, not into calm, but into the kind of desperate improvisation that separates the living from the dead. When ammunition runs low, when positions become untenable, when the only choice left is between retreat and annihilation. When survival becomes less about fighting and more about finding a way to run that doesn't turn into a rout. Pinned down behind fallen logs with bullets chewing bark from the trees overhead, Glenn's people reach that moment. Aaron, who has spent so much time recruiting for Alexandria that most people forget he's also one of their best marksmen, provides steady covering fire from the edge of their defensive position. His rifle cracks with methodical precision, each shot designed not necessarily to kill, but to keep the saviors' heads down long enough for Eugene to work his particular brand of magic. Eugene, hands shaking but mind focused with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes when terror meets expertise, crouches beside a fallen savior truck 20 yards away. His fingers move across wires with the sure touch of someone who has spent countless hours studying engines and electrical systems. The hot wiring process that should take 10 minutes gets compressed into 30 seconds of desperate efficiency, because Eugene understands that everyone's survival depends on his ability to turn theoretical knowledge into practical action. Meanwhile, Glenn grapples with Negan in the dirt between the two sides, their hand-to-hand combat providing a strange anchor point around which the larger battle revolves. Negan is stronger, better trained, more experienced in close-quarters violence. But Glenn has something that trumps all of those advantages: the absolute certainty that letting go means watching everyone he loves die. They roll across the ground in a tangle of limbs and desperate strikes, each trying to gain a position that might provide a momentary advantage. Negan's knee drives toward Glenn's ribs. Glenn deflects and responds with an elbow aimed at the man's throat. The fighting is ugly, efficient, stripped of any pretense of honor or fairness. This is combat at its most basic level. Two people trying to hurt each other enough to create an opportunity. "You think this changes anything?" Negan snarls between attempts to get his hands around Glenn's throat. "You think because you got lucky once, that makes you dangerous?" Glenn doesn't waste breath on answers. He's learned enough about Negan to know that the man's need to talk during violence is both a strength and a weakness. It helps him maintain psychological control, but it also divides his attention. Instead, Glenn focuses on staying alive long enough for his people to create an escape route. Sasha and Rosita work together with the fluid coordination of two people who have learned to trust each other completely. Sasha's rifle provides precision fire from an elevated position behind a massive oak tree, while Rosita moves through the underbrush with the stealth skills that have kept her alive since the world ended. They're clearing an escape route methodically, taking out saviors who are positioned between their group and the truck that Eugene is desperately trying to start. "Everyone to the truck!" Rick's voice cuts through the gunfire with command authority that Glenn hasn't heard in hours. "Move! Move! Move!" The retreat happens with practiced efficiency, born from too many similar situations. Carl provides covering fire while Michonne shepherds the non-combatants toward their escape vehicle. Aaron maintains his position until the last possible moment, then leapfrogs backward in controlled bounds that speak to military training most people never knew he had. Each movement is calculated, coordinated, designed to get everyone out alive. But Glenn remains locked in combat with Negan, unable to disengage without giving the man a clear shot at the retreating group. The tactical situation is becoming untenable. His people need to leave, but Glenn can't abandon his position without exposing them to Negan's immediate counterattack. That's when Glenn lands the hit that changes everything. It's not elegant or sophisticated, just a straight right cross aimed at Negan's jaw with every ounce of strength Glenn has left. The blow connects with a wet crack that sounds like breaking wood, and Negan's head snaps back hard enough that Glenn can see the man's eyes lose focus for just a moment. But a moment is enough. Rick appears beside them like a force of nature, his hands closing around Glenn's shoulders with enough force to leave bruises. "Glenn, we're leaving!" "Now!" Glenn allows himself to be pulled away from Negan, but he keeps his eyes locked on the man's face, even as Rick drags him toward the truck. There's blood on Negan's lip, a thin trickle of red that makes him look less like an invincible warlord, and more like just another person who can be hurt. "This isn't over!" Negan shouts after them, his voice carrying rage and something that might actually be respect. You hear me? This is just the beginning." The truck engine roars to life just as they reach it, Eugene's hands still shaking as he slides over to make room for Rick behind the wheel. Everyone piles in with the desperate efficiency of people who know that the difference between escape and capture might be measured in seconds. Glenn finds himself pressed against the tailgate, Maggie's arms around him, her hands already working to wrap bandages around his shredded palms. The truck lurches into motion with a grinding of gears that suggests Eugene's hot wiring job was more about function than finesse. But functional is enough. They're moving. They're together. And for the first time in hours, no one is shooting at them. "You could have gotten us all killed," Rick says, once they're clear of the immediate danger, his voice carrying anger that Glenn recognizes as the complex fury of someone whose authority has been completely bypassed. "What were you thinking? We had a chance to negotiate, to find a way out of this that didn't involve open warfare." Glenn looks at Rick across the cramped truck bed, seeing something in the man's expression that goes beyond tactical disagreement. This is about leadership, about the fundamental question of who makes decisions when everything hangs in the balance. Rick, who has carried the weight of keeping everyone alive for so long that he's forgotten there might be other approaches than careful compromise and strategic surrender. "And you were ready to let him kill us one by one," Glenn replies, his voice steady despite the fire in his bandaged hands. "Abraham was just the beginning. Then it would have been me. Then someone else after that. How many of us were you willing to sacrifice to avoid a fight?" The words hit Rick like a physical blow, and Glenn can see the recognition dawn in the man's eyes. Because Rick knows Glenn is right, the strategic calculus Rick was running in his head included acceptable losses, included the possibility that some of them wouldn't make it home as long as the majority survived. It's the kind of thinking that has kept them alive through impossible odds, but it's also the kind of thinking that treats people as resources rather than family. "Glenn was brave," Carl says from his position near the truck's cab, his young voice carrying absolute conviction. "Someone had to do something. Dad, you taught me that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when they're bigger than you." The simple statement hits everyone in the truck like a revelation. Carl, who has grown up in this world of necessary compromises and strategic retreats, reminding them that there are still principles worth fighting for, that sometimes courage matters more than tactics, that the difference between surviving and living might be the willingness to take impossible risks for the right reasons. Darryl sits in the corner of the truck bed, his face a mask of guilt and self-recrimination. Glenn can see the weight the man is carrying, the knowledge that his outburst after Abraham's death started the chain of events that led to this confrontation. Darryl, who has spent years learning to control his anger, blaming himself for letting emotion override strategic thinking at the worst possible moment. "This ain't your fault," Glenn says to Darryl, pitching his voice to be heard over the truck's engine. "Abraham's death, what happened back there, none of that's on you. Negan was always going to escalate. We just chose to meet him head-on instead of on our knees." Darryl's response is a nod that carries more weight than words could. The understanding between them is complete. Both men who have spent their lives being underestimated. Both men who chose to fight when fighting seemed hopeless. Both men who understand that sometimes the only choice is to refuse to surrender, even when surrender seems like the smart play. The truck rolls through the Georgia darkness, carrying them away from the clearing where Abraham's body lies abandoned and toward Alexandria, where they'll have to explain to their community that they've just declared war on an enemy whose full strength they don't yet understand. The conversation continues in fits and starts, punctuated by the road noise and the weight of what they've just experienced. Maggie works on Glenn's hands with focused precision, cleaning wounds and applying bandages with the skill of someone who has learned battlefield medicine through necessity rather than choice. Her touch is gentle but efficient, and Glenn can feel her processing everything that happened through the movement of her fingers across his damaged palms. "We're going to have to fight now," Sasha observes from her position near the truck's side. "No more pretending we can avoid conflict. No more hoping we can find peaceful solutions. Negan's not going to forget what happened tonight." "Good," Rosita says, her voice carrying steel that wasn't there hours ago. "Let him remember. Let him remember that we don't kneel." As the truck approaches Alexandria's walls, Glenn sees the lookouts scrambling to identify the approaching vehicle, sees the gates beginning to open in response to Rick's signal. In a few minutes they'll be home, safe behind walls that suddenly feel less secure than they did when they left. They'll have to explain to their families and friends that the relative peace they've enjoyed is over, that the world has become dangerous in new ways. But sitting in the truck bed with his hands bandaged and his people around him, Glenn realizes something that surprises him. For the first time in years, he feels like they have a chance. Not because the tactical situation has improved. If anything, it's gotten dramatically worse. But because they've stopped pretending that survival is the only goal worth pursuing. They've remembered what it means to fight for something instead of just against something. And that, Glenn thinks, might make all the difference. The war has begun. But for the first time since the world ended, Glenn believes they can win it. Chapter 8. Preparing for War. There's a particular quality to the silence that follows when you tell a community of survivors that their relative safety has just ended. Not the shocked quiet of unexpected bad news, but the heavy, processing silence of people trying to understand that everything they thought they knew about their situation has fundamentally changed. When the comfortable illusion of security gets stripped away, and everyone has to confront the reality that peace was always temporary. Sitting in Alexandria's makeshift meeting hall with his hands wrapped in bandages that are already seeping blood, Glenn watches his neighbors process the news of Abraham's death and the war that's coming. The emergency town meeting had been Rick's idea, but it's Glenn who finds himself at the center of the conversation. People keep looking at him, not with the casual acknowledgement they've always given the quiet supply runner, but with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for leaders. His bandaged hands, the dried blood on his clothes, the way he carries himself now, all tell a story that everyone is trying to read. "Abraham is dead," Glenn says, when Rick seems to struggle with how to begin the explanation. "Negan killed him to make a point about power and control. But that's not the end of the story. It's the beginning." The words ripple through the assembled community, like stones dropped in still water. Faces cycle through grief and fear and something that might be anger. These are people who have already lost too much, who came to Alexandria specifically because it represented the possibility of safety, of rebuilding something that looked like normal life. The idea that violence has found them again hits differently than it would have in the early days when everyone expected to die. Carol emerges from the shadows near the back of the room, and Glenn realizes he hasn't seen her since they returned. She's been isolating herself, dealing with her own demons about violence and necessary choices. But the news of Negan's brutality seems to have cut through whatever internal struggle she was having. Her face carries the kind of cold determination that Glenn remembers from the prison, from Terminus, from all the times when Carol decided that being soft was a luxury none of them could afford. "We're not victims anymore," Glenn continues, his voice carrying across the room with surprising authority. "We spent years just trying to survive, just trying to find a place where we could stop running. But survival isn't enough. Not when there are people like Negan who think safety is something they can take away whenever they feel like making a point. The response isn't unified. Glenn can see the community dividing in real time, people choosing sides based on fundamental beliefs about how to handle an impossible situation. Some faces show the kind of grim acceptance that speaks to years of hard experience. Others carry fear that's bigger than tactical concerns, the terror of people who thought they'd finally found sanctuary, discovering that sanctuary was always an illusion. Rick steps forward, and Glenn can see the tension in his friend's shoulders, the weight of leadership that has been his burden for so long. Glenn's right that we need to take this threat seriously, Rick says carefully. But we also need to be smart about how we respond. Negan has resources we don't understand yet, numbers we can't match. We need to think about defensive strategies that protect everyone, not just the people who can fight. The disagreement between them isn't spoken directly, but everyone in the room can feel it. Rick, advocating for the careful, measured approach that has kept them alive through so many impossible situations. Glenn, pushing for something more aggressive, more proactive. The divide isn't just about tactics, it's about fundamental philosophy, about whether safety comes from avoiding conflict or confronting it head-on. Maggie rises from her seat near the front of the room, one hand resting protectively on the curve of her belly. Her pregnancy makes her participation in strategic planning complicated, but her voice carries absolute conviction when she speaks. I support Glenn, she says simply. Abraham died because we tried to avoid conflict instead of dealing with it. How many more people have to die before we admit that some fights can't be avoided? Her words hit the room like a revelation, because everyone knows what it costs Maggie to advocate for violence while she's carrying a child. The idea that someone who has the most to lose from warfare is willing to support an aggressive approach carries weight that pure tactical arguments couldn't achieve. Dr. Denise's replacement, a nervous man named Pete, who took over medical duties when their previous doctor died, tends to Glenn's hands while the strategic discussion continues around them. The damage is severe, deep lacerations where the barbed wire carved through flesh and muscle. Pete's hands shake slightly as he cleans the wounds, but his voice is steady when he speaks quietly to Glenn. These are going to take weeks to heal properly, Pete says. You shouldn't be handling weapons, shouldn't be putting stress on these injuries. But I'm guessing you're not going to listen to medical advice right now. Glenn flexes his fingers experimentally, feeling the pull of stitches and the fire of damaged nerve endings. I can still shoot, he says. I can still fight. That's what matters. Morgan stands near the window, his face a mask of internal struggle that Glenn recognizes from his own recent moral wrestling. Morgan, whose entire post-apocalyptic identity has been built around the principle that all life is precious, that violence only creates more violence, that there has to be a way to solve problems without killing. The reality of Negan's existence challenges everything Morgan believes about redemption and the possibility of peaceful solutions. There has to be another way, Morgan says, his voice carrying the desperate conviction of someone trying to hold on to principles in a world that seems designed to destroy them. Violence only leads to more violence. If we respond to brutality with brutality, how are we any different from them? The question hangs in the air, and Glenn can see people struggling with it. Because Morgan isn't wrong about the cycle of violence, about the way that choosing to fight often means becoming the kind of person who hurts others. But Glenn has spent the last few hours learning that sometimes the alternative to fighting is dying on your knees. The difference, Glenn says carefully, is that we're fighting to protect something, not to take it away from others. Negan kills people to prove he can. We're willing to kill to prove he can't. Enid stands up from her position near the young adults, her face set with determination that reminds Glenn painfully of Carl's earlier declaration. "I want combat training," she says. "I want to learn how to fight. Glenn showed us tonight that sometimes standing up to bullies is the only option." The request hits the room like a small explosion. Enid, who has been protected and sheltered as much as anyone could be in this world, volunteering to become a combatant. Her willingness to embrace violence for defensive purposes becomes a symbol of how much the community's situation has changed in just a few hours. Father Gabriel steps forward from his usual position near the back wall. His collar marks him as someone whose entire worldview should reject violence, but his face carries the practical acceptance of someone who has learned to reconcile faith with necessity. "The church can serve as a secondary defensive position," he offers. "Stone construction, elevated position, good sight lines. If we're preparing for siege warfare, we need multiple strongholds." Spencer Monroe, who has never missed an opportunity to criticize leadership decisions, seizes the moment to voice the opposition that others are thinking, but not saying. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Spencer declares, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who has never been taken seriously. "First, Rick gets us into conflicts we can't win. Now Glenn thinks he can solve everything by punching our problems in the face. When does the leadership start making decisions based on what's best for the community instead of personal vendetta?" The accusation hits Glenn harder than he expected, because there's a grain of truth buried in Spencer's self-serving rhetoric. Glenn's actions tonight were driven by personal conviction, by love for Maggie, by the refusal to watch his family kneel in the dirt. Whether those motivations align with the community's best interests is a question he hasn't fully considered. Michonne steps between the growing tension, her voice carrying the authority of someone who has learned to mediate conflicts without taking sides. "We need unity, not division," she says firmly. "Whether we choose Rick's approach or Glenn's approach or some combination of both, we need to choose together. A community that fights itself can't defend against outside threats." Her words create a moment of clarity that cuts through the emotional noise of the discussion. Because everyone in the room knows she's right, that their survival depends not just on tactical decisions, but on maintaining the social cohesion that has kept them together through every previous crisis. The sound of running footsteps outside interrupts the meeting, and Aaron bursts through the door with the kind of urgency that makes everyone reach for weapons that aren't there. "Scouts!" he says breathlessly. "Savior scouting parties on the perimeter, 3 different positions, all watching the walls." The news transforms the theoretical discussion into immediate reality. Negan's people are already here, already assessing Alexandria's defenses, already beginning the process of determining how to break what Glenn's people are trying to build. The war isn't coming. It's already begun. Glenn rises from his chair, wincing as the movement pulls at his injured hands, and heads for the weapons cache they've maintained since settling in Alexandria. The community follows him, their earlier disagreements temporarily set aside by the immediate necessity of survival. Rick falls into step beside him, and Glenn can feel the weight of their unresolved leadership tension. "We have enough to make them pay," Glenn says, as he surveys their stockpile of rifles and ammunition. "Not enough to win a prolonged siege, but enough to make Negan think twice about the cost of taking this place." The weapons inventory becomes a moment of revelation for the community. Some people discover they're more willing to fight than they expected. Others realize that their principles matter more than their safety. A few quietly begin calculating whether surrender might be preferable to warfare. But as Glenn watches his neighbors choose between Rick's cautious pragmatism and his own willingness to confront danger head-on, he realizes that the division isn't really about tactics. It's about identity, about whether they want to be the kind of community that survives by avoiding conflict or the kind that survives by refusing to be victims. Looking at the weapons in his bandaged hands, Glenn knows which kind of community he wants to build. The question is whether Alexandria will choose to build it with him. Outside, Savior Scouts continue their surveillance, and Glenn can feel the weight of their attention like a physical presence. The war is coming whether they're ready or not. But for the first time since Abraham died, Glenn thinks they might actually have a chance to win it. Not because their tactical situation has improved, but because they've finally decided to fight for something instead of just against something. And sometimes, Glenn thinks, that makes all the difference. Chapter 9. The siege begins. There's a particular quality to the light that comes just before dawn in Georgia. Not quite darkness, not quite day, but something suspended between the two that makes everything look fragile and temporary. The kind of light that reminds you that safety is always conditional, that peace is always borrowed time, that the difference between sleeping soundly and fighting for your life can be as thin as the horizon line where night meets morning. Standing on Alexandria's watchtower with his bandaged hands wrapped around a rifle stock, Glenn watches that light reveal the extent of Negan's response to their defiance. The Savior convoy stretches across every approach to Alexandria's walls like a steel and chrome noose. Trucks, motorcycles, armored vehicles that speak to a level of organization and resources that Glenn hadn't fully grasped during their nighttime encounter. This isn't just a raid or a punishment detail. This is an army, a full military response to what Negan clearly sees as an unacceptable challenge to his authority. Glenn counts vehicles, estimates personnel, tries to calculate ammunition stores based on visible weapons. The tactical assessment is grim. Alexandria's walls were designed to keep out walkers, not organized military forces. Their defensive positions are adequate for small-scale raids, not siege warfare. Their supplies are sufficient for normal operations, not extended conflict. But Glenn has learned something important about fear in the last 24 hours. It's only useful if it helps you make better decisions. Fear that paralyzes. Fear that makes you surrender before the fight begins. That's the kind of fear that gets everyone you love killed. The voice that cuts across Alexandria's walls carries easily in the morning air, amplified by speakers mounted on Savior vehicles. Negan's tone is conversational, almost friendly, like he's calling to an old friend instead of besieging a community. "Glenn, come out and let's finish our conversation." The sound hits Glenn like a physical blow, not because it's unexpected, but because of how personal it feels. This isn't about Alexandria or strategic resources or territorial control. This is about him, about the fact that he caught Negan's bat, turned the man's own weapon against him, and walked away with blood on his hands instead of dying in the dirt like he was supposed to. Glenn adjusts his grip on the rifle, feeling the pull of stitches in his palms, and keys the radio that connects him to the other defensive positions. This is Glenn. Everyone stay in position. Nobody responds to anything Negan says. But Negan isn't finished talking. "You embarrassed me in front of my people," the voice continues, carrying across Alexandria like Judgment Day made audible. "That requires correction. See, I've built my entire organization on the principle that nobody, and I mean nobody, tells me no and walks away to brag about it. You've created what we call a precedent problem. From his position on the watchtower, Glenn can see Rick moving between defensive positions, his face a mask of calculation and growing desperation. Rick approaches the base of the tower and calls up in a voice pitched to carry only as far as necessary. "Glenn, we need to talk. We can negotiate our way out of this." The words hit Glenn like a revelation about the fundamental difference in their leadership styles. Rick, even faced with overwhelming odds, still thinking in terms of compromise and strategic surrender. Rick, whose instinct is to find a way to survive that doesn't require choosing between victory and annihilation. "Negotiating is surrender," Glenn calls back, loud enough that his voice carries to other defensive positions. "Negan didn't come here to talk. He came here to make an example." The exchange crystallizes something that has been building since their return from the lineup. Not just disagreement about tactics, but about identity, about what kind of people they want to be, what kind of community they want to build, what principles are worth dying for. The saviors begin their psychological warfare with the methodical efficiency of people who have done this before. Music starts blaring from multiple vehicles, not random noise, but carefully selected songs that speak to loss and desperation and the futility of resistance. Voices call out over the music, taunting Alexandria's residents by name, proving that Negan's intelligence network knows more about their community than anyone had realized. "Hey Carl, you still playing dress-up with Daddy's hat? Hey Maggie, how's that baby bump coming along? Hey Carol, still pretending to be a sweet little housewife?" Each taunt is designed to be personal, to get under skin and into minds, to create the kind of stress that makes people make mistakes. Glenn recognizes the strategy from his own supply runs, psychological pressure applied precisely to weak points until something breaks. The first exchange of gunfire comes when a savior team tests Alexandria's south wall with probing movements that dare the defenders to reveal their positions. Glenn coordinates the response through his radio, keeping their return fire minimal and precise, enough to discourage testing, not enough to reveal their full defensive capabilities. "South wall, 3-round burst, then relocate." Glenn's voice carries calm authority that surprises him. "Don't give them patterns to analyze. Don't waste ammunition on suppressive fire unless they breach the perimeter." His tactical thinking has evolved beyond anything he learned during supply runs. This is strategic command under pressure, the kind of leadership that emerges when someone who understands both logistics and human psychology suddenly finds themselves responsible for keeping everyone alive. Maggie appears at the base of the watchtower, her face set with determination that Glenn recognizes from every other impossible situation they've faced together. She's wearing tactical gear and carrying a rifle, and when she speaks, her voice cuts through all the reasonable arguments about pregnant women staying in safe locations. "I fight beside my husband," she says simply. That's not a request. The declaration hits Glenn in a place he didn't know was vulnerable. Because Maggie is right. They've never faced impossible odds separately, never divided their strength when everything they care about was at stake. The idea that she would retreat to safety while he coordinates their defense violates every principle they've built their relationship around. "Second floor of the church," Glenn says into his radio. "Elevated position, good sight lines, stone construction for protection. That's where Maggie sets up. But it's Carol who provides the most unexpected tactical option. She appears like a ghost at the edge of the watchtower's sight line, wearing the walker disguise that made her invisible during their darkest days at Terminus. The blood and grime and carefully orchestrated decay that transform her from recognizable human into just another shambling corpse. "I can get through their lines," Carol says quietly, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who has accepted the necessity of terrible choices. Hilltop Kingdom. They need to know what's happening here. They need to understand that if Negan wins, they're next. The strategy is brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. Carol disappearing into the mass of walkers that perpetually surround any fortified position, becoming invisible through the same camouflage that has saved their lives before, moving through savior lines to carry word to potential allies who might not even know that war has begun. The crossbow bolt that splits the air inches from Glenn's head arrives without warning, Dwight's precision marksmanship coming close enough that Glenn can feel the wind of its passage. The message is clear. They know exactly where he is, exactly what kind of threat he represents, exactly how easy it would be to end this siege by ending him. "Still got those fast reflexes?" Negan's voice calls from behind the cover of an armored truck, his laughter carrying genuine amusement despite the tactical situation. "But reflexes only get you so far, kid. Sooner or later, somebody's going to be faster." Glenn shifts position without responding, moving to a spot that provides better cover while maintaining sight lines to coordinate defensive operations. The taunt is designed to get him to respond, to reveal more about his position and capabilities than tactical necessity requires. He's not going to give Negan the satisfaction. But the near miss with Dwight's crossbow crystallizes something that Glenn has been trying not to think about. Their food supplies are calculated for normal operations, not siege conditions. Their water comes from sources that could be compromised. Their ammunition is finite. Their medical supplies are already being strained by his injured hands and the stress casualties that always accompany prolonged conflict. Time is not on their side. "We can't win this alone," Glenn says into his radio, the words carrying across all defensive positions simultaneously. It's both tactical assessment and philosophical declaration, an acknowledgement that survival sometimes requires admitting you need help, that strength sometimes means knowing when to reach out instead of standing firm, looking out over Alexandria's walls at the siege force that wants to break everything his people have built. Glenn realizes that this moment represents more than just tactical challenge. This is about whether the communities scattered across Georgia will stand together or fall separately, about whether the future belongs to people like Negan, who rule through fear, or people like Glenn, who fight for the chance to choose their own fate. The siege has begun. But Glenn is starting to think that maybe, just maybe, it might also be the beginning of something larger. Something that could change not just Alexandria's fate, but the entire balance of power in their small corner of the post-apocalyptic world. From his position on the watchtower, he can see Carol already moving toward the perimeter, becoming invisible through practiced expertise in survival techniques that most people never want to learn. Soon, she'll be carrying their message to communities that might not even know they have a choice about what kind of world gets built from the ashes of the old one. The war isn't just about Alexandria anymore. It's about whether people who choose to build something together can stand against people who choose to take things apart. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Glenn thinks they might actually have a chance to find out. Chapter 10. Allies and Enemies. There's a particular moment in every siege when the outcome stops being determined by walls and weapons and starts being determined by choices made in darkness by people who think no one is watching, when the real battle shifts from the perimeter to the spaces between allies, when survival depends less on holding defensive positions and more on knowing who you can trust when everything falls apart. 3 miles from Alexandria's walls, moving through walker-infested woods with the practiced silence of someone who has learned to become invisible, Carol carries news that might change everything. She reaches Hilltop as the second day of the siege begins, her walker disguise so convincing that even the community's sentries don't recognize her until she peels away the blood-soaked rags and reveals herself to Gregory's shocked council. The conversation that follows is brief, tense, and ultimately successful in ways that Carol couldn't have predicted. It's Jesus who makes the difference. Jesus, whose moral clarity cuts through Gregory's political calculations and bureaucratic hesitation like a blade through fog. When Carol describes Negan's siege, Abraham's death, Glenn's stand against seemingly impossible odds, something crystallizes in Jesus' expression that speaks to principles deeper than tactical advantage. We mobilize every fighter we have, Jesus declares, his voice carrying the kind of authority that doesn't ask for permission. If Negan breaks Alexandria, we're next. If we let him destroy communities one at a time, there won't be anyone left to stand with us when our turn comes. The message travels from Hilltop to the kingdom through networks of communication that most people never see. Scouts and traders and wanderers who carry information between isolated communities, like antibodies carrying resistance through a larger organism. By the time Carol's news reaches King Ezekiel, it has been filtered through multiple perspectives, analyzed for accuracy, evaluated for strategic implications. King Ezekiel's decision surprises everyone, including himself. The kingdom has survived through careful neutrality, through avoiding exactly the kind of entangling alliances that Carol is requesting. But there's something about the description of Glenn's defiance, about a delivery boy turned war leader who refused to kneel, that resonates with something deeper than political calculation. We provide support, Ezekiel announces to his council, his theatrical persona dropping away to reveal someone making a choice that will define his community's future. Not because it's strategically advantageous, but because it's right. Because some stands are worth taking, even when the odds are impossible. Back in Alexandria, Spencer Monroe makes his own choice in darkness. He approaches the main gate at 3 a.m, when the guard rotation puts Aaron on watch duty, and most of the community is trying to catch sleep between savior harassment attacks. Spencer's plan is elegant in its simplicity. Surrender Glenn to Negan, end the siege, return Alexandria to the careful neutrality that kept them safe before Glenn's defiance changed everything. "This is madness," Spencer whispers to Aaron, his voice carrying the desperate conviction of someone who genuinely believes he's saving everyone. "One man's pride isn't worth the whole community. We give them Glenn, they leave us alone. Everybody wins except the guy who got us into this mess in the first place." But Rosita overhears the conversation from her position in the nearby watchtower, and her response is immediate and unforgiving. Her radio call cuts across all defensive positions simultaneously. Spencer's at the main gate trying to surrender Glenn. Someone needs to handle this now. The betrayal attempt gets stopped before it can develop momentum, but the psychological damage spreads through Alexandria's defenders like poison in a water supply. The knowledge that someone inside their walls was willing to trade Glenn's life for the promise of safety creates a fracture in community trust that goes deeper than tactical concerns. The first night assault comes 2 hours later, as if Negan had been waiting for signs of internal division before testing Alexandria's defenses in earnest. Savior teams probe multiple points along the perimeter simultaneously, using suppressed weapons and coordinated movement that speaks to professional military training. The attacks are designed not to breach the walls but to create casualties, to wear down morale, to demonstrate that Alexandria's defensive positions aren't as secure as their residents want to believe. Glenn moves between defensive positions during the assault with the kind of calm urgency that keeps panic from spreading. His radio coordination keeps multiple teams focused on tactical necessities instead of the fear that threatens to overwhelm rational thinking. When the North Wall team reports movement in the tree line, Glenn redirects support from the South Wall without hesitation. When the church position runs low on ammunition, he authorizes resupply from their carefully hoarded reserves. Contact South Wall, 30 meters from the gate. Rosita's voice crackles through the radio network. Multiple hostiles, suppressed weapons. Copy South Wall, Glenn responds immediately. North Wall, redirect 2 shooters to support. Church position, maintain overwatch on east approach. Nobody breaks position unless I give the direct order. His hands, still healing from the barbed wire damage, crack open during the extended firefight, fresh blood seeping through bandages that weren't designed for combat operations. But Glenn continues coordinating defensive operations as if the pain is merely another tactical factor to be managed rather than addressed. The assault ends with casualties on both sides, 3 saviors down, 2 Alexandria defenders wounded, ammunition expended, nerves frayed, but the walls still holding. It's the kind of tactical draw that feels like victory when you're desperately outmatched, the kind of small success that keeps hope alive when everything else suggests surrender. But Negan's escalation comes with dawn. The walkers arrive in numbers that transform harassment into genuine siege warfare. Hundreds of them, driven toward Alexandria's walls by savior teams, using noisemakers and scent trails, and the herding techniques that turn individual undead into collective weapon systems. The sight of so many walkers pressing against their defenses creates the kind of primal terror that bypasses rational thought and goes straight to survival instinct. They're using the dead as assault troops, Glenn observes into his radio, his voice maintaining analytical calm despite the horror of the tactical situation. Standard defensive fire won't work against this many. We need to think about fallback positions. Aaron coordinates with scout teams that materialize from the woods like ghosts, advance elements from Hilltop and the Kingdom, moving through walker-infested terrain to assess Alexandria's situation and establish communication with the besieged community. The arrival of Allied scouts transforms the siege from isolated desperation into something that might actually be winnable. Hilltop forces 6 hours out, Aaron reports, his voice carrying the first genuine hope anyone has felt since the siege began. Kingdom troops 12 hours behind them. Jesus sends word that they're bringing heavy weapons and medical supplies. In the church-turned field hospital, Pete operates on wounded defenders with hands that shake from stress and exhaustion. The stone construction that Gabriel offered as defensive advantage has become sanctuary for people whose bodies couldn't withstand the physical demands of siege warfare. Each surgery becomes a race against time, each successful treatment a small victory against the larger forces trying to destroy everything Alexandria represents. Rick finds Glenn on the watchtower during a brief lull in the assault, and the conversation that follows represents a fundamental shift in their relationship. Rick's face carries the weight of someone whose certainties have been proven wrong, whose careful strategic thinking couldn't account for the variables that Glenn's courage introduced. "You were right to fight," Rick says simply, his voice carrying the kind of acknowledgement that costs something to offer. "I was thinking about survival. You were thinking about what survival is worth." The admission hits Glenn harder than he expected, because it represents more than tactical vindication. It's recognition that leadership sometimes means making choices that seem impossible, that the difference between existing and living might be the willingness to risk everything for principles that can't be calculated in ammunition counts or casualty ratios. Daryl volunteers for the kind of mission that everyone knows is necessary, but nobody wants to volunteer for. Sabotage operations against savior vehicles parked beyond Alexandria's walls, using stealth and explosives to reduce their mobility and create tactical opportunities for the approaching Allied forces. It's the kind of high-risk, low-probability mission that appeals to Daryl's particular combination of guilt and fury and desperate need to contribute something meaningful to their defense. "I can get close enough to damage their trucks," Daryl says, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who has made peace with dangerous choices. "Create chaos. Maybe give our people a chance when the cavalry arrives." But the escalation that changes everything happens in the church, where Maggie doubles over in pain that has nothing to do with combat stress and everything to do with the life growing inside her. Early labor brought on by siege conditions, by psychological pressure, by the knowledge that she might not live to see her child born. Pete's face goes pale as he realizes that their medical capabilities might not be sufficient for the complications that premature birth could create. "We need to end this siege," Pete says quietly to Glenn, his voice carrying medical authority that cuts through all tactical considerations. "Maggie needs facilities we don't have, care I can't provide. Hours matter now, not days." The news transforms the siege from strategic challenge into personal emergency. Glenn realizes that all the tactical victories in the world won't matter if Maggie and their unborn child pay the price for his refusal to surrender. The weight of leadership becomes the weight of knowing that principles have costs, that standing up to bullies sometimes means watching the people you love suffer for choices you made. But looking toward the horizon where Allied forces are approaching Alexandria's borders, Glenn realizes that maybe, just maybe, they won't have to choose between principles and survival. Maybe courage and tactical thinking and the willingness to reach out for help might be enough to save everyone he loves. The combined forces from Hilltop and the Kingdom represent more than military assistance. They represent the possibility that communities can stand together against people who try to rule through fear, that the future might belong to people who choose cooperation over domination. As the third day of the siege begins, Glenn knows that everything will be decided in the next few hours. Not just Alexandria's fate, not just Maggie's survival, but the entire question of what kind of world gets built from the ashes of the old one. The Allies are coming. The enemy is entrenched. And Glenn is about to find out whether refusing to kneel was the beginning of something larger than anyone imagined. Chapter 11. The Final Assault. There's a moment in every battle when chaos reaches its absolute peak and then breaks, not into calm, but into the kind of crystalline clarity that separates victory from annihilation. When all the careful planning and strategic thinking gives way to pure instinct, when survival depends less on tactics than on the willingness to keep moving forward when everything around you is falling apart. Standing on Alexandria's walls with explosions lighting the dawn sky, Glenn watches that moment arrive. The three-way battle erupts with the kind of violence that transforms landscape into wasteland in minutes. Savior assault teams breach Alexandria's outer defenses just as Allied forces from Hilltop and the Kingdom arrive at the perimeter, creating a collision of opposing forces that turns the siege into something resembling organized chaos. Automatic weapons fire cuts through the morning air from multiple directions. Explosions shake the ground as Daryl's sabotage mission reaches its climax in a chain reaction of burning vehicles that sends smoke billowing across the entire battlefield. Glenn doesn't hesitate. The tactical situation requires coordination between Alexandria's defenders and their arriving allies, and that coordination can't happen from behind walls. He needs to link up with the reinforcements, needs to create unity of command before the three-way nature of the battle allows Negan's forces to defeat them piecemeal. "I'm going out," Glenn announces into his radio, his voice cutting through the sound of combat with calm authority. "Maintain defensive positions until I establish contact with Allied forces. Do not advance beyond the walls without direct orders." The sortie from Alexandria happens with the kind of precision that speaks to weeks of preparation compressed into hours of desperate planning. Glenn leads a team of their best fighters through the main gate, using the chaos of the multi-directional battle as cover for movement that would be suicidal under normal circumstances. But these aren't normal circumstances. This is the moment when everything they've built either survives or dies. Hand-to-hand combat erupts the moment they clear Alexandria's walls. Savior assault teams, caught between defending against Allied attacks and maintaining their siege positions, fall back toward prepared defensive positions that suddenly become traps when Glenn's sortie hits them from an unexpected angle. The fighting is brutal, efficient, stripped of any pretense of honor or fairness. This is violence at its most basic level. People trying to hurt each other enough to create tactical advantage. Glenn adapts to his damaged hands with the kind of improvisation that keeps people alive when conventional tactics fail. His grip strength is compromised, his fine motor control unreliable, but his understanding of leverage and timing allows him to turn disadvantage into opportunity. When a savior comes at him with a knife, Glenn uses the man's momentum against him, redirecting the attack into empty air before responding with an elbow strike that drops his opponent to the ground. That's when Negan appears like a force of nature unleashed. "You should have taken my offer," Negan roars as he swings Lucille with the kind of fury that comes from watching careful plans dissolve into chaos. The bat cuts through air where Glenn's head was a split second before, close enough that Glenn can feel the wind of its passage. The single combat that follows happens in the middle of a larger battle, but for Glenn, it becomes the only thing that matters. Negan is stronger, better trained, more experienced in close-quarters violence, but Glenn has something that trumps all of those advantages: the absolute certainty that losing means watching everyone he loves die. They circle each other through the rubble and smoke, each looking for an opening that might provide momentary advantage. Negan's attacks come in waves of controlled fury, each swing of Lucille calculated to end the fight with devastating finality. Glenn responds with the kind of defensive movement that turns survival into art, using urban terrain to create barriers and opportunities that his damaged hands can exploit. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Negan snarls between attempts to corner Glenn against a destroyed savior truck. "You think because you got lucky once, that makes you special?" Glenn doesn't waste breath on responses. He's learned enough about Negan to know that the man's need to talk during violence is both strength and weakness. It helps maintain psychological control, but it also divides attention. Instead, Glenn focuses on staying alive long enough for the larger battle to shift in their favor. Rick provides covering fire from Alexandria's walls, his rifle cracking with methodical precision that keeps other saviors from interfering in the single combat between Glenn and Negan. Each shot is calculated to create space rather than casualties, designed to give Glenn the room he needs to maneuver without ending the fight through outside intervention. "Glenn!" Rick's voice carries across the battlefield. "East flank clear. Move toward the church." The tactical information allows Glenn to shift the combat toward terrain that favors his defensive style over Negan's aggressive attacks. He leads Negan through the maze of destroyed vehicles and defensive barriers, using every piece of cover to create opportunities for counterattack, while avoiding the devastating power of Lucille's barbed wire. Meanwhile, Maggie coordinates evacuation of non-combatants from inside Alexandria's walls, her voice steady despite labor pains that are becoming impossible to ignore. Her radio calls cut through combat noise with the kind of authority that comes from absolute necessity, people's lives depending on clear communication and effective organization. "Medical team to the church," Maggie's voice crackles through the radio network. "All non-essential personnel to basement shelter. Combat teams maintain positions unless specifically redirected." The explosions that scatter Savior vehicles come from Daryl's sabotage mission reaching its climax in a chain reaction of burning fuel and ammunition that transforms Negan's mobile advantage into tactical liability. The psychological impact is as important as the material damage. Savior fighters suddenly finding themselves isolated from their transportation and support networks, forced to fight on foot against enemies who know the terrain. Allied forces from the Kingdom exploit the confusion with the kind of flanking maneuver that turns tactical draws into decisive victories. Kingdom fighters, led by experienced combat veterans who understand urban warfare, sweep around the Savior position and attack from angles that Negan's forces hadn't prepared for. The carefully orchestrated siege becomes a chaotic battlefield where superior numbers and coordination begin to tell. But it's Glenn who provides the moment that breaks Savior resistance entirely. He disarms Negan through a combination of precise timing and desperate courage, using the man's overconfidence against him in a way that leaves Lucille spinning through the air, to land yards away from either combatant. For a moment that stretches like eternity, Glenn stands over Negan with a scavenged knife in his damaged hands, the power to end everything balanced on the edge of a decision. "Do it," Negan whispers, blood trickling from his split lip. "Prove you're just like me. Prove that when it comes down to it, everybody's the same." Glenn looks down at the man who killed Abraham, who terrorized communities across Georgia, who built an empire on the principle that might makes right, and the strong should dominate the weak. All he has to do is drive the knife forward, and the war ends, the threat disappears. Everyone he loves becomes safer. "I'm not you," Glenn says simply, and tosses the knife away. The choice reverberates across the battlefield like a shockwave. Savior fighters, watching their invincible leader defeated but spared, begin laying down weapons in a surrender that spreads through their ranks like a virus. Without Negan's psychological dominance, without the certainty that their leader cannot be beaten, the entire organizational structure that held the Saviors together begins to collapse. The retreat happens with the kind of organized panic that transforms armies into mobs. Savior teams abandon positions, vehicles, equipment, anything that might slow their escape from a battle that has turned decisively against them. The siege of Alexandria ends not with dramatic explosion, but with the simple recognition that continuing to fight will only result in more casualties for no strategic gain. Community celebration begins before the last Savior vehicle disappears over the horizon, but the joy is tempered by losses that can't be forgotten. Abraham's absence hangs over everything like a shadow, reminding everyone that victory came at a cost that goes beyond tactical calculation. 2 more Alexandria defenders died during the final assault, and their names will be added to the memorial wall that keeps growing despite every effort to build something safer. Negan, secured in Alexandria's makeshift detention facility, manages one final psychological assault, even in captivity. "This isn't over between us," he promises Glenn through the bars, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone making a prediction rather than a threat. "You think because you won one battle, you've changed anything? You think because you showed mercy, that makes you different from me? We'll see." Glenn's hands receive proper medical treatment for the first time since he caught Lucille, Pete working with supplies brought by Allied forces to clean and suture wounds that have been held together by bandages and willpower for too long. The damage is extensive. The healing process will be slow, but function should return with time and therapy. You'll have scars, Pete observes as he works, nerve damage that might never fully heal, but you'll be able to use them. You'll be able to hold the things that matter. Rick's formal acknowledgement comes during the community meeting that follows the battle, when Alexandria's residents gather to process what they've accomplished and plan what comes next. His words carry the weight of someone whose certainties have been fundamentally altered by watching impossible things become possible. Glenn serves as co-leader of Alexandria, Rick announces, his voice carrying across the assembled community with absolute conviction. Equal authority, equal responsibility, equal voice in decisions that affect all of us. We're stronger with multiple perspectives, stronger when leadership is earned rather than assumed. The power structure that emerges from the siege represents something new. Not hierarchy based on fear or tradition, but cooperation based on respect and proven capability. Glenn's leadership style, focused on bringing out the best in others rather than imposing his will through force, becomes a model for how communities might govern themselves in a world where traditional authority structures have collapsed. Looking at his bandaged hands, at Maggie resting after successfully delivering their child despite the stress of siege warfare, at the Allied forces who answered their call for help, Glenn realizes that catching Negan's bat was just the beginning of something larger than anyone imagined. They didn't just survive the siege. They proved that communities can stand together against people who try to rule through fear. They demonstrated that moral leadership can triumph over authoritarian rule when people are willing to take impossible risks for principles that can't be calculated in ammunition counts or casualty ratios. The war isn't over. Negan's promise makes that clear. But for the first time since the world ended, Glenn believes they can build something worth defending, something based on choice rather than fear, cooperation rather than domination, hope rather than despair. The future remains uncertain, but it belongs to them now. And that, Glenn thinks, makes all the difference in the world. Chapter 12. New Beginnings. There's a particular quality to the light that comes after victory. Not the harsh brightness of triumph, but something softer and more complex that carries both celebration and sorrow in equal measure. The kind of light that illuminates new possibilities while casting shadows that remind you of everything it cost to reach this moment. The kind of light that makes you understand that winning is just the beginning of building something worth protecting. Standing in Alexandria's community center with his son in his arms, Glenn experiences that light for the first time in his life. The memorial service for Abraham and the other casualties of the war takes place on a morning when spring seems to arrive all at once, transforming the Georgia landscape from winter's harsh browns into the soft greens of new growth. The service itself is simple, personal, focused on remembering the people who died rather than celebrating the victory their deaths helped achieve. Abraham's chair sits empty at the front of the gathering, and when people speak about him, they talk about his terrible jokes and his protective instincts, and the way he could make everyone feel safer just by being present. Abraham would have said something inappropriate right now, Glenn observes when it's his turn to speak, his voice carrying the kind of fond grief that comes when love and loss become inseparable. Something about how we better not make his death meaningless by sitting around crying when there's work to be done. He was always better at moving forward than looking back. The laughter that follows is warm and necessary, breaking through the formal sadness of the memorial to reach something more authentic. Because Abraham would have wanted laughter, would have wanted the people who survived to focus on living rather than dying, on building rather than mourning, on finding ways to make the future better than the past. Maggie gives birth 3 days after the siege ends, in Alexandria's makeshift medical facility, with Pete providing care that's supplemented by supplies and expertise from their new allies. The labor is difficult, but not dangerous. Stress-induced complications resolved through the kind of medical attention that becomes possible when communities pool their resources instead of hoarding them. Glenn holds his son for the first time, with hands that are still bandaged but healing, feeling the weight of new life against his chest like a promise that the future will be different from the past. The baby is healthy, alert, impossibly small and perfect in ways that make Glenn understand what people mean when they talk about unconditional love. Abraham Glenn Rhee, Maggie says when Pete asks about the birth certificate, her voice carrying the kind of quiet conviction that makes naming choices into statements about values and memory. He carries the name of someone who died, protecting the people he loved. The Intercommunity Council forms naturally from the alliance that saved Alexandria, growing from tactical necessity into something that might actually represent a new way of organizing society. Representatives from Hilltop, the Kingdom, and Alexandria meet weekly to discuss trade, security, resource sharing, and the dozens of administrative details that determine whether cooperation becomes sustainable or collapses under the weight of competing interests. Glenn accepts the position of military coordinator not because he wants authority, but because the job needs someone who understands both tactics and diplomacy, someone who can think strategically without losing sight of the human costs of strategic decisions. His first major challenge comes from an unexpected source: integrating former saviors who surrendered during the battle into communities that still remember their brutality. Some of them were following orders because they were afraid, Glenn explains to the council during a debate about prisoner treatment. Some of them believed in Negan's vision because they didn't see alternatives. If we want to build something better than what Negan offered, we need to prove that people can change when given the chance. The integration process is slow, careful, built on demonstrated behavior rather than promises or good intentions. Former saviors work under supervision, contribute to community projects, prove their commitment to peaceful cooperation through months of consistent action. Some fail the test, choosing to leave rather than accept rehabilitation. Others find in the allied communities the kind of purpose and belonging that Negan's organization could never provide. Negan remains imprisoned in Alexandria's detention facility, but his psychological influence lingers like smoke in closed rooms. He represents unfinished business, the possibility that authoritarian leadership might emerge again if people become complacent about protecting the freedoms they've fought to establish. Glenn visits him occasionally, not for information or reconciliation, but to remind himself of what they're building in opposition to. "You think you've won something," Negan observes during one of these visits, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who understands human nature's darker possibilities. "You think because you beat me, you've changed the fundamental rules about how power works. But power is like water. It always finds a way to flow toward whoever's willing to take it. And sooner or later, somebody's going to be willing." Glenn's reputation spreads beyond the allied communities through networks of communication that most people never see. Traders and scouts and wanderers who carry stories of the siege along with goods and information. Other survivor communities, isolated and struggling with their own versions of Negan's brutality, send representatives to Alexandria seeking alliance and assistance. The requests create opportunities and challenges in equal measure, forcing Glenn to learn the difference between helping others and overextending their own capabilities. Rick focuses on diplomatic relations with the dedication of someone who has found his true calling in the careful work of negotiation and compromise. His conversations with other community leaders help establish protocols for trade, dispute resolution, mutual defense, and the dozens of administrative details that determine whether cooperation becomes lasting or dissolves into conflict. The division of responsibilities between Rick's diplomatic focus and Glenn's security coordination creates a leadership structure that draws on both men's strengths without requiring either to sacrifice their principles. Carol returns to active community leadership with the renewed sense of purpose that comes from watching impossible things become possible. Her experience with covert operations and psychological warfare becomes invaluable for training programs that prepare other communities to resist authoritarian takeover. She develops curricula that teach people how to organize resistance networks, how to maintain morale under siege conditions, how to preserve community values when external pressure threatens to break social cohesion. Daryl finds peace through the physical work of rebuilding infrastructure damaged during the siege. His mechanical skills and understanding of engineering principles make him indispensable for projects that strengthen Alexandria's defenses while improving quality of life for residents. There's something therapeutic in the work of construction after so much destruction, something that helps process grief and guilt through the tangible evidence of progress and improvement. Eugene develops new defensive technologies inspired by lessons learned during the siege, his theoretical knowledge finally finding practical application in projects that could save lives during future conflicts. Early warning systems that detect approaching vehicles, communication networks that remain functional during combat conditions, weapon modifications that give defenders advantages over numerically superior attackers. His work represents the difference between surviving through luck and surviving through preparation. Glenn trains new fighters using tactical principles learned from fighting Negan, but his curriculum focuses as much on ethics as technique, as much on when not to fight as when fighting becomes necessary. The students come from all the allied communities, young people who understand that peace requires the ability to defend it, that freedom depends on people willing to take risks for principles that can't be calculated in ammunition counts or casualty ratios. The goal isn't to become better killers, Glenn explains to a training group that includes Carl, Enid, and volunteers from Hilltop and the Kingdom. The goal is to become better protectors, to understand the difference between violence that preserves humanity and violence that destroys it. Future challenges emerge as scouts report other hostile groups moving through Georgia, survivors who have chosen different responses to the collapse of civilization than the cooperation that defines the allied communities. Some represent potential allies who might be convinced to join the growing network of peaceful communities. Others represent threats that will need to be addressed before they can destabilize the fragile peace that victory over Negan created. Glenn's final reflection comes during a quiet moment on Alexandria's walls, holding his son while watching the sunset paint the Georgia sky in colors that remind him of hope and possibility. The baby sleeps peacefully against his chest, unaware of the violence and struggle that preceded his birth, unaware of the sacrifices that created the world he will grow up in. One moment, Glenn whispers to his sleeping son, his voice carrying the kind of wonder that comes from understanding how completely life can change based on choices made in seconds. One moment when I caught a baseball bat instead of letting it kill me. That moment led to this moment, led to you, led to everything. The community celebration that evening focuses not just on survival, but on the preservation of their humanity through circumstances that could have easily destroyed it. People share food, tell stories, make music, engage in all the activities that distinguish living from merely existing. Children play games while adults discuss plans for expanding agriculture, improving medical facilities, establishing schools that will teach the next generation both practical survival skills and the principles worth surviving for. Glenn and Maggie sit together on their front porch as the celebration continues around them, planning for their son's future in a world that feels more hopeful than any they've known since the collapse began. They talk about schools and playmates, and the possibility that Abraham Glenn Rhee might grow up in a world where cooperation is normal, where communities help each other instead of competing for scarce resources, where leadership is earned through service rather than seized through violence. He'll have chances we never had, Maggie observes, her hand resting on Glenn's bandaged fingers while their son sleeps between them. He'll grow up thinking that people are supposed to help each other, that communities are supposed to work together, that violence is the last resort instead of the first option. He'll also grow up knowing that good things require protection, Glenn replies, feeling the pull of healing tissue in his palms. That freedom isn't free, that peace requires vigilance, that sometimes you have to catch the baseball bat instead of letting it kill you. Looking at his son's face in the soft light of evening, Glenn understands that catching Negan's bat was just the beginning of a story that will continue long after he's gone. The Allied communities represent something new in the post-apocalyptic world, proof that people can choose cooperation over domination, that moral leadership can triumph over authoritarian rule, that the future doesn't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. The challenges aren't over. Negan's imprisonment doesn't eliminate the possibility that other authoritarian leaders will emerge. The Allied community's success doesn't guarantee that other survivor groups will choose cooperation over conquest. The peace they've established doesn't protect against the dozens of ways that good intentions can lead to unintended consequences. But for the first time since the world ended, Glenn believes they have a chance to build something that will last, something based on choice rather than fear, cooperation rather than domination, hope rather than despair, something worth the scars on his hands and the memory of Abraham's sacrifice and all the difficult choices that brought them to this moment. His son stirs in his sleep, and Glenn adjusts his hold with the careful precision of someone learning to be gentle with hands that have known violence. The future remains uncertain, but it belongs to them now. And that, Glenn thinks, makes all the difference in the world. The war is over. The building begins tomorrow.